The European Union will, in October, require importers of certain carbon-intensive goods to pay for their products embody carbon emissions. The European Union is implementing the carbon border adjustment mechanism on imported goods from outside the bloc. CBAM aims to prevent carbon leakage by subjecting the import from developing countries to a carbon levy linked to the carbon price payable under the EU emissions trading system. Experts say the measure is punitive and dramatically reduces the space for developing countries to achieve growth and create jobs. So to discuss the implications of carbon border adjustment mechanism, we are joined by Seutame Maimele, a Sustainable Growth Economist and a research lead on climate change and trade at Trade and Industrial Policy Strategies. Good to have you. Thanks so much for joining us.
Morning, Leon. Thanks for having me, and good morning to the listeners.
So even reading it, it was a lot. It's a lot for me to absorb. So can you perhaps explain it to us basically? What exactly does this actual carbon border adjustment mechanism mean, and why is the EU proposing this?
So the carbon border adjustment mechanism, short for CBAM, so they usually call it CBAM. So is a carbon border tax. So it's gonna be, levied on GHG products that have a higher content of GHG emissions. And at the moment, they're looking at some certain sectors. There are 6 sectors at the moment, but there's a possibility of including other sectors. So the current sectors that are included in the mechanism is iron and steel. There's aluminium. There's hydrogen. There's also fertilizers, there's cement, there's also electricity production. So in the South African case, we also see that, South Africa exports a lot of iron and steel to the EU. So what the CBAM requires is that next time you're going to be, importing your products into the European market, you'll have to show them that, show them the carbon content that goes into the production methods of, for example, when iron and steel, then you have to later on, pay for the emissions in the production process of those goods. So is both an environmental and an economic measure. First of all, to prevent carbon leakage, and which carbon leakage occurs when we start to see that globally there's a lot of mechanisms put in place to reduce global gas emissions. So CBAM is one of those mechanisms that is being introduced, and in order to do that, they want to equalize the playing level field for products that are coming into the European market and everywhere else in the world. So in a nutshell, I think that's briefly what CBAM is all about.
Okay, so this obviously is going to have an effect on us because the EU is one of South Africa's major export destinations, as you alluded to as well. So perhaps you can tell us, how high is South Africa's carbon intensity?
So if you look at the South Africans, South Africa has, looking specifically in the iron and steel sector or metal sector, so there is considered one of the outliers in terms of, carbon intensity. So if you look at countries such as, the BRICS countries, your China's, your India, so their carbon intensity is around 3,000. For ton of every $1 million, so in the South African case, that amount goes to around 5,000. So that's, it's considered as an outlier, and it becomes a problem, especially for sectors in the iron and steel sector. So considering that we export a lot of those products, especially now, since they've, already legislated the mechanism early in May this year. So they've included new products there, such as, iron ore, which we know in the South African case, we export a lot of that into the European market. So initially, when we've done an initial assessment on this, and I think the amount of, level of exposure, the total exports, back then was like $1.2 billion, and now that amount has actually increased to $2.8 billion with the inclusion of like some of the new sectors that I've already mentioned, like iron ore, some articles of iron and steel. So, looking at, screws and bolts. So there is an inclusion of new products. And later on, we're going to see a lot of new products coming into, into CBAM. And that amount now is going to be increasing, right? So making,
I mean, when we look at it, it's round the corner. I mean, CBAM is scheduled to begin on the 1st of October this year. And I mean, basically requiring EU importers to start reporting emissions embedded in the CBAM products that they import. So perhaps we can focus a lot on economically the ramifications for South Africa.
So the CBAM has a lot of issues, right? So from our side, as we do research, what comes to mind is that, we have to see the mechanism as both an economic, an environmental, opportunity and challenges. So there are opportunities and challenges that comes with the introduction of the mechanism. So some of the challenges, as we've, we've already seen, is that, we have to report, GHG emissions at the product level. So in the South African case, and especially in most developing countries, they don't have, what they call the monitoring, reporting, and verifying, systems of the GHG emissions. So that is considered to be expensive, especially for firms that operate in some of the, sectors that have already been identified under CBAM, like iron, steel, and aluminium. So it's very expensive to have that system in place. But in the South African case, what we see is that we already have what we call SABC, which reports GHG emissions at the industrial level. So there's an opportunity for us to leverage that system that we already have to create a more, comparable system with CBAM. Right. So in that process, it's going to take some time, and there are a lot of issues that comes with the implementation of CBAM. For example, now there's the time period is too short for, especially developing countries to transition. So as much as they have a transition period where we're only going to be, reporting GHG emissions. So to have a system in place like, an MVR system in place is going to be expensive. And there are other issues as well, environmental concerns that comes with that. So we know through the United Nations framework on, Convention on Climate Change, there's a principle that, for example, developing countries should have a certain, responsibility. So as much as we have been, contributing to global climate, global, greenhouse gas emissions, so we should have a different, responsibility as compared to developing countries. And what CBAM is doing is trying to, shift the climate responsibility to developing countries, and that's the problem. It becomes both an economic and environmental problem for the country.
The country and Africa at large, because the reality is that this is something that's going to affect the continent quite dramatically.
Yes, of course. I mean, in the African continent as well, you see that, coming back to the carbon leakage issue. So what CBAM is trying to do is to avoid carbon leakage, right? So, but looking in the African context, so we start to see that in South Africa is the only country that has like carbon price in place. And that, carbon price is very low by international standards. And looking in the African continent, as much as I think Botswana, your Morocco and Ivory Coast are looking forward to having a carbon price in place, there is a lot of opportunities and challenges in the African continent where you see, some of the climate change policies that we have in place are more relaxed, which will allow, carbon leakage to prevail, which, the environmental issues will come. Of course, there will be some economic opportunities that comes with that. For example, we'll start seeing, firms moving from the European market coming to the African continent, planting, investing in some of those sectors that are mentioned on the CBAM. But of course, there are both opportunities and challenges that come with CBAM, especially in the African continent. And I think for us, looking at the WTO issues is, an opportunity, an entry point actually for the African continent to use, CBAM as an opportunity to start reforming the WTO as a whole and other, multilateral organizations.
Yeah, indeed. So let's talk about what we can do in the meantime, especially, South Africa, where, because we see that there is a massive push at the moment. We all know it for renewable power plants. But in the meantime, what is it that South Africa can do?
So in the meantime, we've seen there was, implementation act of CBAM that was published, open for comment. And what the DTIC did, the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition did, is they've already, submitted a commentary on, some of these issues that we are highlighting now here. and they are, they are looking forward to having an engagement with the EU. And we've seen other countries, for example, India, have been doing it. They're engaging with the EU on some of the CBAM issues that we talk about on a daily basis. And what we can do now, I think, as much as I think also, TIPS has already been doing a lot of engagements in preparation for that. And I think next week, Tuesday, we're going to be having a development dialogue to just bring different, stakeholders who have been working in the space to speak about these issues. Then later on, engaging with the EU. So that's from in parallel to engaging with the EU, of course, having the monitoring and reporting and verification system in place of GHG emissions. I think that's something that, for example, the Department of Forest and Fisheries and Environment can engage with, for example, industry players on how looking forward to finding some solutions in terms of having a domestic, monitoring, reporting, and verification system, because that's going to be very important, especially in the next round, which is the transition period that starts from the 1st of October this year. So it's very important to start engaging on some of these, CBAM issues in the short term.
All right, let's leave it there. We'll see what develops from this. But that's Seutame Maimele talking to us. He's a sustainable growth economist and a research lead on climate change and trade at Trade and Industrial Policy Strategies. And this is really talking about this, the implementation of this policy from behalf of the EU. And you kind of look at what it is that South Africa uses. I mean, we really do. We use our key exports are coal and metals such as platinum and gold, which really are largely produced, when you look at it, by electricity generated from fossil fuels, and its manufactured exports like cars rely on coal generation. So it really is going to be quite interesting to see how this one is handled and how it's going to impact us, unfortunately.